I grew up in the South Bronx in New York City, like during the late 70s and early 80s. It was one of those places that when other folks heard you were from there, they were afraid of you and for you. You know, I was a master at avoiding the discussion, oh, where are you from? And, and I'd say, oh, I'm from New York, and change the subject and ask them like where they were from and ask them like really detailed questions about their neighborhood because I was so afraid that they would ask me about where in New York. When it was completely unavoidable, you'd see that shadow, drop over people's eyes. Doesn't matter what they thought about you when they didn't know. Suddenly they had this knowledge, and because this knowledge told them that you should be feared, I felt that. I was never really afraid in my neighborhood, which is an odd thing, for people to hear me say. There were whole stretches of blocks in my neighborhood where you could walk up and down them and all you saw were the burned out shells of buildings. It was like, well, what's there to be afraid of? Even when, I watched buildings, on my corners burn down, even when my brother was killed, in a drug war, I wasn't afraid. I was more depressed. It was more of a state of confusion. Like, how could it be like this? I see the way things, happen on TV. How come we live like this? I went to Wesleyan during the divestment. That time, South African divestment, and they were engaged in all the civil disobedience at Wesleyan. And I remember clearly, it's like, you know what? I can't do that because if I get arrested, my parents don't have the money to get me out on bail. I didn't grow up, in an activist circle. So when I started doing the activism that I do now, I assumed that when you do it, it's because you're working with and for, the folks that you say you're fighting for. But I often find that there's this feeling that, if you win, then you've got nothing to fight for. And so therefore you don't really want to win. And I find that kind of weird, to tell you the truth. The thing that drives me crazy about most activism, it is just emotion-oriented. It's not goal-oriented. Yeah, we wanted to kick Giuliani's butt when he wanted to put this huge waste facility on our waterfront. But, I, on some level, knew that just the act of just demonstrating and protesting and fighting about it wasn't really going to feed me. How do we turn this into, something that our community might want? We got a whole bunch of canoes and, cleaned up the place enough, put wood chips down, where we couldn't dig up everything else. At first people thought I was like, girl, you on crack. Why would you want our kids playing down there in the industrial section? Who do you think you are? You must not have children. But suddenly the neighborhood had a waterfront park and they were like, wow. I wanted to work in the South Bronx because I felt the people in my community needed a better place to be. Like, we shouldn't have to think that if you wanted to breathe clean air, that you had to go to somebody else's neighborhood. If you wanted to take your kid to a park, that you had to leave the neighborhood. You shouldn't have to leave.